The hegemony of Kethva had ruled the spiral arm for exactly 14,347 standard galactic cycles. They knew this because they'd been keeping count. Obsessively, religiously, and with the kind of mathematical precision that only comes from having absolutely nothing better to do than catalog your own superiority. Their capital ships were crystalline monuments to excess, each one roughly the size of a small moon and twice as pretentious. They gleamed with that particular shade of obnoxious gold that screams, "We have more resources than taste," and bristled with weapons that could crack planets like eggs. The hegemony called these vessels divine instruments of absolute will, which was really just a fancy way of saying, big scary ship that makes things go boom. For over 14 millennia, the formula had worked perfectly. Show up, announce your godhood, demonstrate your overwhelming firepower, collect tribute, rinse and repeat. It was like running a protection racket, except with more religious overtones and significantly better health benefits. The beings of Kethva themselves were, well, calling them impressive would be generous. Picture a praying mantis that had been hitting the gym for about 6 months too many. Then add delusions of grandeur and a fashion sense that could charitably be described as aggressively shiny. They stood nearly 3 meters tall, their chitinous exoskeletons polished to a mirror finish that reflected their own magnificence back at them in an endless loop of self-congratulation. Their leader, Supreme Divinity Zithkar, yes, that was actually his title. The Kethva weren't known for subtlety. Currently stood on the command bridge of the flagship Eternal Dominion, surveying star charts with the smug satisfaction of someone who'd never encountered anything resembling actual resistance. "Tactical Hierophant Zethalos," he intoned, his voice carrying that special kind of authority that comes from never having been told to shut up. "Report on the next system scheduled for divine intervention." Tactical Hierophant Zethalos, whose job title was somehow even more ridiculous than his boss's, consulted his holographic displays with practiced efficiency. "Supreme Divinity, the target system designates itself as Sol, single star, 9 planetary bodies, 1 inhabited world in the habitable zone. The indigenous species calls itself human." "Human," Zithkar repeated, testing the word like a wine that might have gone slightly off. "How quaint. What is their technological classification?" "Primitive by all accounts." "They've achieved basic interplanetary travel, some limited FTL capability, and appear to have recently established a handful of colony worlds. Standard pre-Enlightenment civilization should capitulate within moments of our arrival." Now here's where things get interesting. See, the Kethva had a very specific understanding of how first contact scenarios played out. Step 1, arrive in overwhelming force. Step 2, demand acknowledgement of their divinity. Step 3, collect tribute and move on. In 14,000 years, this process had never varied. Not once. They were about to learn why humanity had a saying about assumptions. Captain David Bulldog Morrison stood on the bridge of the UES Defiance, watching the hyperspace readings with the kind of calm that only comes from having survived 3 colonial wars, 2 alien incursions, and 1 particularly nasty divorce. At 43, Morrison had the weathered look of a man who'd seen the universe's worst and decided to stare right back at it. "Skipper," called out Lieutenant Commander Alex Reeves from the sensor station. "We're picking up massive gravitic distortions at the edge of the system. Whatever's coming through hyperspace is, well, it's big." "How big are we talking?" Morrison asked, settling into his command chair with the casual ease of a man who'd made that same motion 10,000 times before. "Preliminary scans suggest somewhere in the neighborhood of 40 kilometers long, maybe 15 wide, single vessel." Morrison whistled low. "Well, that's not ominous at all. Comm, patch me through to Fleet Command." "Negative on that, sir," replied Communications Officer Katie Vance. "Whatever this thing is, it's broadcasting some kind of interference pattern across all frequencies. We're on our own until it clears up." The Defiance was what Earth's military planners like to call a heavy cruiser, which was really just a polite way of saying, we welded as many guns as possible to a hull and hoped for the best. She wasn't the biggest ship in the human fleet. That honor went to the dreadnoughts that were currently scattered across 3 different systems, naturally. But she was tough, fast, and packed enough firepower to make most problems reconsider their life choices. Most problems, however, weren't the size of small moons. "Sir," Reeves called out, his voice tight with the kind of professional tension that meant very bad things were about to happen. "Contact emergence in 30 seconds. It's massive. All hands, this is the captain," Morrison announced over the ship-wide comm. "We've got an unknown contact about to drop into our backyard. Battle stations, people. Let's give our guests the proper welcome." The bridge erupted into controlled chaos as the crew snapped to their duties. Warning klaxons sounded throughout the ship, and Morrison could feel the subtle vibration as the Defiance's weapon systems came online. 6 particle beam cannons, 8 torpedo tubes, enough point defense to swat flies in 3 star systems, and one very special surprise that Fleet R&D had installed just last month. Emergence in 10 seconds, Reeves announced. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Contact! Space twisted, folded in on itself, and vomited out something that shouldn't have been able to exist. The eternal dominion hung in the void like a golden middle finger extended toward reality itself, its crystalline hull reflecting the light of Sol in patterns that hurt to look at directly. Jesus Christ on a pogo stick, someone whispered over the comm. Morrison couldn't disagree with the sentiment. Skipper, Vance called out. We're receiving a transmission. Universal Translator is working on it, but... well, you're going to want to hear this. The transmission crackled to life, filled with the kind of pompous authority that usually preceded really terrible requests. Primitive beings of the Sol system, I am Supreme Divinity Sithkar of the hegemony of Kethva, rightful ruler of all that exists within this arm of the galaxy. You will cease all resistance, acknowledge our divine supremacy, and submit to our eternal will. Failure to comply will result in the complete annihilation of your species and the conversion of your world into a monument to our glory. The bridge fell silent for about 3 seconds. Well, Morrison said finally, that was impressively arrogant. Vance, open a channel. Channel open, sir. Morrison leaned back in his chair and spoke with the kind of calm reasonableness that had gotten him through 2 decades of military service and one particularly contentious custody hearing. Unknown vessel, this is Captain David Morrison of the United Earth ship Defiance. I appreciate the dramatic entrance. Really, top-notch theater. But I'm afraid we're going to have to pass on the whole acknowledge your divine supremacy thing. It's nothing personal, you understand. We're just not really the surrendering type. Now, I'm going to have to ask you to turn that pretty ship of yours around and head back to wherever you came from, before this situation gets unpleasant for everyone involved. On the bridge of the Eternal Dominion, Supreme Divinity Zithkar experienced something he hadn't felt in over 14,000 years. Confusion. Did that primitive just refuse our divine mandate? He asked Zethalos, his voice carrying the kind of bewilderment usually reserved for discovering that gravity had suddenly started working backwards. It would appear so, Supreme Divinity, Zethalos replied, his own mandibles clicking in what might have been nervous agitation. This is unprecedented. Unprecedented didn't begin to cover it. In the entire recorded history of the hegemony, not a single species had ever refused to acknowledge their obvious divinity. The very concept was so foreign that their language didn't have a word for it. Zithkar's compound eyes narrowed as he processed this new information. Perhaps they misunderstood our message. Repeat the transmission, but louder this time. Sir, Zethalos ventured carefully. I'm not certain that volume is the issue. Louder. The transmission repeated, this time with enough amplification to be heard from 3 star systems away. Zithkar was particularly proud of the dramatic emphasis he put on eternal will. Morrison listened to the repeat performance with the expression of a man watching his neighbor's dog take a dump on his lawn for the 3rd time this week. Well, he said when it was finished, they certainly are persistent. Vance, open the channel again. Channel open, sir. Listen up, bug boy, Morrison said, and his voice carried just a hint of the edge that had made colonial pirates reconsider their career choices. I don't know what kind of operation you've been running out there, but you just flew into the wrong neighborhood. This is human space. Those are human colonies. And that big blue marble behind me is the human homeworld. We don't acknowledge anybody's divinity except our own questionable life choices. So here's what's going to happen. You're going to turn that floating disco ball around and jump back to whatever rock you crawled out from under. Or I'm going to introduce you to some very human concepts like aggressive negotiations and kinetic diplomacy. The silence that followed was the kind of complete, stunned quiet that usually preceded either enlightenment or extreme violence. On the Eternal Dominion, Zithkar's world had just tilted off its axis. Not only had these primitives refused to acknowledge his divinity, they'd been actively rude about it. Tactical Hierophant, he said, his voice dropping to the low, dangerous tone that meant someone was about to have a very bad day. Are our weapons systems operational? All divine instruments are primed and ready, Supreme Divinity. Then perhaps it's time these humans learned the price of blasphemy. Target their vessel and prepare to demonstrate the futility of defying the gods. Zethalos hesitated. Supreme Divinity, perhaps we should attempt further communication. The time for communication has passed. Fire. The Eternal Dominion's forward batteries opened up with the kind of firepower that had been reducing civilizations to component atoms for 14 millennia. Streams of coherent energy that could melt asteroids lanced across space toward the tiny human vessel. On the Defiance, Morrison watched the incoming fire with the detached professional interest of a man who'd been shot at by experts. "Evasive maneuvers," he ordered calmly. "All weapons, return fire. Show them what humans do to wannabe gods." What happened next would have been called impossible by anyone who'd spent the last 14,000 years watching the hegemony steamroll their way across the galaxy. The Defiance didn't just dodge the incoming fire. She danced around it, her pilot threading the needle between energy beams with the kind of precision that comes from actual combat experience against people who really want to kill you. Human ships, it turned out, had been designed with a very different philosophy than HFY vessels. Where the hegemony built monuments to their own superiority, humans built tools for survival. The Defiance was fast, maneuverable, and packed with weapon systems that had been tested in actual combat against actual enemies who shot back with actual intent to kill. "Direct hit on their forward section," reported Weapons Officer Lieutenant Tom Barnes. "Their shields are, well, they're impressive, but they're taking damage." Morrison allowed himself a small smile. "Keep firing. Let's see how divine they really are." The battle that followed was like watching a heavyweight boxer fight a really pissed-off hornet. The Eternal Dominion was bigger, more heavily armed, and theoretically more powerful. But the Defiance was faster, smarter, and flown by people who'd learned to fight by fighting things that actually fought back. For the first time in 14,000 years, a HFY warship found itself in an actual fight. "Supreme divinity!" Zethlos called out as another human torpedo found its mark. "Their weapons they're actually penetrating our divine armor." This was, to put it mildly, not supposed to happen. HFY ships were protected by energy fields that could deflect planetary bombardments. The idea that a primitive vessel could actually damage them was so far outside their understanding of reality that several crew members were having what could only be described as existential crises. "Impossible," Sithkar snarled. "We are gods! Our technology is perfection incarnate. How can these primitives—" His rant was interrupted by the ship shuddering under another impact. Through the transparent aluminum viewports, he could see the human vessel darting between his ship's weapons like some kind of mechanical insect, constantly firing, constantly moving, never giving his gunners a clear shot. It was, he had to admit, rather impressive. Not that he was going to say that out loud. "All batteries, concentrate fire," he ordered. "Bring the Divine Wrath online." The Divine Wrath was the Eternal Dominion's primary weapon, a massive energy cannon that ran the length of the ship's spine. It had been used exactly 17 times in the last 14,000 years, and each time had resulted in the complete destruction of whatever it was pointed at. "Sir," Zethlos said carefully, "the Divine Wrath requires 47 seconds to charge. If we use it, use it." On the Defiance, Morrison watched the enemy ship's energy readings spike through several different types of impossible. "Skipper," Reeves called out. "They're charging something big. Really big. Like Planet Killer big." Morrison considered this information with the calm of a man who'd made peace with mortality somewhere around his third colonial war. "Well," he said finally, "I suppose that's our cue. Barnes, is our special surprise ready?" "The prototype?" "Sir, we've never field-tested it," Command said. "Command said a lot of things. Is it ready?" Barnes checked his console and nodded. "Charged and ready, sir. But if this doesn't work, then we'll be dead and it won't matter. Target their primary weapon and fire." What Barnes fired wasn't technically a weapon. It was what the boys in R&D like to call a spatial displacement device, which was really just a fancy way of saying, "We figured out how to make holes in space-time and we're probably going to regret it later." The device created a small, very small, artificial wormhole that connected 2 points in space. In theory, you could use it to redirect enemy fire, transport supplies, or even move ships across vast distances. In practice, nobody had been brave enough to actually test it until right now. The beam lanced out from the Defiance and struck the Eternal Dominion just as the Divine Wrath finished charging. For a moment, nothing happened. Then physics got really angry. The Divine Wrath fired directly into the wormhole that had appeared in front of its muzzle. The beam traveled through folded space-time, emerged from the other end of the wormhole, and struck the Eternal Dominion from behind at point-blank range. The ship that had called itself Divine proceeded to shoot itself with its own planet-killer weapon. The explosion was visible from Mars. On the bridge of the Defiance, the crew stared at their sensor readings in the kind of stunned silence that usually followed either great victories or catastrophic accidents. "Well," Morrison said finally, That worked better than expected. The Eternal Dominion hung in space, dark and lifeless, its golden hull cracked like an eggshell. Emergency beacons flickered weakly from various sections, broadcasting automated distress calls in a language that sounded very much like someone who just realized they weren't as godlike as they'd thought. "Sir," Vance reported, "we're receiving multiple transmissions from the enemy vessel. They're asking to surrender." Morrison leaned back in his chair and considered this development. In his experience, people who started conversations by claiming to be gods didn't usually end them by asking for mercy. It was, he had to admit, a refreshing change of pace. "Open a channel," he said. The transmission crackled to life, but gone was the pompous authority of before. Instead, Zithkar's voice carried the kind of desperate humility that comes from being on the wrong end of your own planet-killer weapon. "Human vessel, this is Zithkar of the Kethva. We formally request terms of surrender." Morrison smiled. It wasn't a particularly friendly smile. "Well, now we're getting somewhere. This is Captain Morrison. I accept your surrender, but we're going to need to have a little chat about a few things. Like, for instance, what you were planning to do to my planet. We were going to demand tribute, an acknowledgement of our divine status, and possibly convert your world into a monument to our glory. But we see now that this was, perhaps, overly ambitious." "Oh, it was definitely that. Tell me, Zithkar, how many other worlds have you pulled this same routine on?" There was a long pause. "In the last 14,347 cycles, approximately. All of them." Morrison felt something cold settle in his stomach. "All of them?" "The hegemony has brought divine order to 17,412 worlds across this arm of the galaxy. Each one now serves as a testament to our former divine supremacy." The bridge of the Defiance fell silent as the implications of this statement sank in. 17,000 worlds. Billions, possibly trillions of beings, all subjugated by these self-proclaimed gods. Morrison's voice, when he spoke again, carried a chill that made the vacuum of space seem warm. "Vance, patch me through to Fleet Command. I don't care what kind of interference they're broadcasting. Boost the signal. Use quantum entanglement. Send up smoke signals if you have to. This information needs to get to Earth immediately." "What should I tell them, sir?" Morrison looked at the crippled alien vessel hanging in space before them, and thought about 17,000 enslaved worlds. "Tell them we just declared war on some gods," he said quietly. "And tell them we're going to need a bigger fleet." The emergency session of the United Earth Council convened exactly 18 hours after the Defiance's report reached Earth. The council chamber, normally a place of careful diplomatic discourse and political maneuvering, buzzed with the kind of barely controlled energy that usually preceded either wars or revolutions. Admiral Elena Vasquez, Supreme Commander of Earth's combined fleet, stood at the central podium with the bearing of someone who'd spent 40 years making difficult decisions and living with the consequences. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice carrying easily through the chamber. 6 hours ago, we received confirmation that Captain Morrison's initial report was accurate. The alien vessel that entered our space represents something called the hegemony of Kethva, a spacefaring civilization that has spent the last 14,000 years conquering and subjugating every species they encounter. She paused, letting that sink in. "According to the information we've extracted from their databases, yes, their security was about as impressive as their aim. The hegemony currently controls over 17,000 star systems across this arm of the galaxy, each one populated by species that were given the same choice they offered us: submit to their divine authority or face annihilation." Counselor Williams from the Mars Coalition raised his hand. "Admiral, what are we talking about in terms of scale? How many beings are we discussing?" Conservative estimates suggest somewhere in the range of 400 billion sentient beings across those 17,000 systems, all of them living under Kethva rule, all of them paying tribute to support the hegemony's expansion. The chamber erupted in angry murmurs. 400 billion slaves was a number that strained comprehension. "The question before us," Vasquez continued, "is simple. What do we do about it?" Counselor Park from the Europa Industrial Complex stood. "Admiral, with all due respect, we're talking about one human warship against an empire that spans 17,000 star systems. The mathematics alone—" "The mathematics," interrupted a new voice, "are about to change significantly." All eyes turned to Dr. Elizabeth Hayes, director of Earth's Advanced Research Division. She was a small woman with the kind of intense focus that came from spending decades unlocking the universe's secrets, and she was smiling with the expression of someone who just solved a particularly challenging puzzle. "Dr. Hayes," Admiral Vasquez said, "I assume you have something relevant to contribute?" "Indeed I do," You see, when Captain Morrison's crew disabled that Kethva vessel, they did more than just win a single battle. They provided us with access to 14,000 years of technological development. She activated a holographic display that filled the center of the chamber with technical schematics that looked like they'd been drawn by someone with a very advanced degree in making things explode. The Kethva are, how shall I put this delicately, completely terrible at actual warfare. They've spent 14 millennia fighting opponents who surrender immediately upon seeing them. They've never had to innovate, never had to adapt, never had to actually improve their tactics or technology beyond show up and look impressive. She gestured to the display, which shifted to show comparative analyses. Their ships are massive, certainly, and they carry impressive firepower, but they're also slow, cumbersome, and designed primarily for intimidation rather than actual combat. Their weapons systems are powerful but inefficient. Their shields are strong but inflexible. Their tactics are, well, tactics might be too generous a term. Counselor Williams leaned forward. What are you saying, Doctor? I'm saying that the hegemony of Kethva is a paper tiger with delusions of grandeur. They've conquered 17,000 star systems not through superior technology or tactical brilliance, but through intimidation and the universal tendency of most species to avoid fights they can't win. Dr. Hayes smiled, and it was the kind of smile that had historically preceded very bad days for humanity's enemies. The problem is, they just picked a fight with a species that specializes in winning fights they can't win. Admiral Vasquez studied the technical readouts with the expression of a professional soldier seeing opportunity where others saw impossibility. Doctor, are you suggesting we can actually take on an empire spanning 17,000 star systems? I'm suggesting we can do better than that, Hayes replied. I'm suggesting we can liberate it. The chamber fell silent as the implications of that statement settled over them like a blanket made of pure audacity. Think about it, Hayes continued. 17,000 star systems, all held in line by fear and intimidation. What happens when that fear disappears? What happens when those subjugated species realize their gods can bleed? She gestured again, and the display shifted to show strategic projections. We don't need to conquer the hegemony. We need to break it. Show the galaxy that the Kethva aren't divine, aren't invincible, aren't anything more than bullies with big ships. Once that happens, revolution, Admiral Vasquez said quietly. Exactly. 17,000 star systems worth of very angry former slaves, all suddenly remembering what freedom feels like. The chamber buzzed with conversation as the council members processed this information. It was audacious, probably impossible, and almost certainly insane. It was also the most human thing they'd ever considered doing. The question, said Councillor Park, is whether we have the resources to actually pull this off. We're talking about fighting an interstellar empire with a fleet that currently consists of 47 active warships. 47 active warships, corrected Admiral Vasquez, and the most advanced military-industrial complex in this arm of the galaxy. The Kethva have been stagnant for 14 millennia. We've been innovating for survival since we first started hitting each other with rocks. She turned to address the full chamber. Ladies and gentlemen, I propose we do something that's never been attempted in the recorded history of this galaxy. We're going to teach a bunch of self-proclaimed gods what humans do to tyrants. The vote, when it came, was unanimous. Captain Morrison stood on the observation deck of the UES Retribution, watching the construction yards of Luna through the transparent aluminum viewport. The sight before him would have been impossible to imagine just 6 months ago. Humanity had gone to war. Not the limited local conflicts that had characterized human warfare for the past century, but total, species-wide, industrial-scale war. Every shipyard in the solar system worked around the clock. Every mining operation had been expanded. Every research facility had been converted to military applications. In 6 months, humanity had built more warships than they'd constructed in the previous 50 years. Impressive sight, isn't it? Asked a familiar voice behind him. Morrison turned to see Admiral Vasquez approaching, her uniform crisp, despite the obvious signs of someone who'd been working 18-hour days for half a year. That's one word for it, Morrison replied. Terrifying is another. We're betting everything on this, aren't we? We're betting everything on you, Vasquez corrected. You and the other captains willing to take the fight to them. The question is, are you ready? Morrison considered this. 6 months ago, he'd been the captain of a single heavy cruiser on routine patrol. Now he was the Commodore of Battle Group 7, commanding 12 of the most advanced warships humanity had ever built, preparing to lead an assault on an interstellar empire. Admiral, he said finally, I've been thinking about those 17,000 worlds. 400 billion beings who've spent their entire lives as slaves to these self-proclaimed gods. What kind of person would I be if I wasn't ready? Vasquez smiled. That's what I wanted to hear. Your battle group ships out in 6 hours. First target is the Proxima Vega system. According to our Kethva prisoner, it's a minor tributary world with a single garrison vessel. And if our intelligence is wrong, then you improvise. You're good at that. Morrison nodded, then asked the question that had been bothering him for months. Admiral, do you really think we can pull this off? Take on an entire empire with a few dozen ships? Vasquez looked out at the construction yards, where human workers and automated systems labored together to build instruments of liberation. David, she said quietly, 6 months ago, a single human warship defeated what these Kethva considered their most powerful vessel. Not through superior numbers, not through advanced technology, but through superior tactics, superior training, and superior motivation. The Kethva have been fighting unopposed for 14,000 years. We've been fighting for survival since we climbed down from the trees. She turned to face him directly. We're not just going to pull this off, Captain. We're going to do it in a way that ensures nobody ever tries to enslave a human world again. The Proxima Vega system had been under Kethva rule for approximately 3,000 standard cycles, ever since the hegemony had arrived to bring divine order to what had once been a thriving civilization of aquatic beings called the Merhai. The Merhai had been artists and philosophers, their cities built in the shallow seas of their homeworld's 3 main continents. They developed a complex society based on cooperation, creativity, and what could only be described as aggressive pacifism. The kind of society that believed all problems could be solved through careful discussion and really excellent poetry. They'd surrendered to the Kethva approximately 37 seconds after the hegemony warship had demonstrated its firepower by reducing one of their uninhabited moons to cosmic dust. Now, 3,000 cycles later, Proxima Vega 3 was a tribute world, its population reduced to 1/10 of its original size, its cities converted to resource extraction facilities, its culture reduced to whatever the Kethva found aesthetically pleasing. The system was protected by a single Kethva vessel, the Divine Majesty, which was smaller than the Eternal Dominion, but still impressive enough to keep the locals in line. Commander Vectar, the ship's captain, spent most of his time composing what he considered to be divinely inspired poetry and trying not to die of boredom. Garrison duty was the kind of assignment that ambitious young Kethva officers dreaded, stuck in a backwater system, dealing with primitive aliens who didn't properly appreciate their divine nature, counting the cycles until they could request transfer to something more exciting. The last exciting thing that had happened in the Proxima Vega system was when a group of young Merhai had tried to organize a cultural preservation society. Vectar had been forced to reduce 3 of their cities to rubble as an object lesson, and the paperwork had been absolutely dreadful. So when his sensor operator reported multiple hyperspace emergence signatures at the edge of the system, Vectar's first reaction was mild curiosity rather than alarm. "Sensor Acolyte Brendos," he said, not looking up from his latest poem, a 17-stanza meditation on the divine nature of proper tribute collection. "What kind of vessels are we detecting?" "Unknown configuration, Divine Commander. They're not in our database." This was mildly interesting. New ship designs were rare enough to warrant at least some attention. "Display the contacts," Vectar ordered. The tactical hologram shimmered to life, showing 12 ships in formation at the system's edge. They were smaller than Kethva vessels, sleeker, and they moved with a precision that suggested actual competence, rather than the usual amateur hour performance of most primitive civilizations. "Curious," Vectar mused. "Have they transmitted any communications?" "Negative, Divine Commander. They're maintaining radio silence and approaching the 4th planet." Vectar considered this. The 4th planet was a gas giant with several mining stations operated by subjugated Merhai. Perhaps these newcomers were pirates, looking to steal refined resources. It wouldn't be the first time. "Helm, set course to intercept. Communications. Prepare the standard divine mandate transmission. Let's see what these primitives want before we reduce them to component atoms." The Divine Majesty turned ponderously toward the intruders, its captain already composing the opening lines of his intimidation speech. It was shaping up to be a pleasantly exciting day. On the bridge of the Retribution, Morrison watched the Kethva vessel approach with the patient calm of a man who'd spent 6 months preparing for this moment. "Contact bearing 27 Mark 15, range approximately 4 million kilometers in closing," reported his tactical officer. "Single vessel, configuration matches the intelligence reports." "Any sign they've detected our friends?" Morrison asked. "Negative, sir. Stealth packages are holding. The Phantom and Wraith are completely invisible to their sensors." Morrison smiled. The stealth ships were another gift from Dr. Hayes' research division. Human vessels equipped with adaptive camouflage systems reverse-engineered from Kethva sensor technology. They were smaller, faster, and most importantly, completely undetectable to anyone using Kethva sensor arrays. "Sir," called his communications officer, "we're receiving a transmission from the approaching vessel. Let's hear it." The transmission crackled to life with the familiar pompous authority that Morrison had come to associate with very bad days for anyone who wasn't human. "Unknown vessels, you have entered the divine domain of Commander Vectar of the hegemony of Kethva. Identify yourselves and state your purpose, that we may determine whether your existence continues to serve the greater glory of our divine empire." Morrison nodded to his communications officer. "Open a channel." "Channel open, sir." Morrison leaned forward slightly, and when he spoke, his voice carried the kind of casual friendliness that usually preceded very unpleasant surprises. "Commander Vectar, this is Commodore David Morrison of the United Earth Fleet. I have a message for you from the 400 billion beings your people have enslaved over the past 14,000 years. He paused just long enough for the implications to sink in. "The message is, your gods bleed, and we're here to prove it." On the bridge of the Divine Majesty, Vectar experienced the same confusion that his colleague had felt 6 months earlier. These primitives weren't following the script. They were supposed to either surrender immediately, or at least attempt some kind of negotiation. They definitely weren't supposed to sound like they were looking forward to a fight. "Human vessel," he said, injecting as much divine authority into his voice as possible. "You will surrender immediately or face the full wrath of—" His speech was interrupted by proximity alarms as 2 previously undetected ships decloaked directly above and below the Divine Majesty. The stealth vessels opened fire immediately, their weapons targeting the Kethva ship's shield generators with the kind of precision that comes from months of careful planning. "We're under attack!" Brendos called out as the Divine Majesty's shields flickered and died. Multiple contacts, they were hiding somehow. Vectar's mind struggled to process what was happening. In 3,000 cycles of garrison duty, nobody had ever actually shot at him. The concept was so foreign that he almost couldn't comprehend it. "Return fire," he ordered. "All weapons, engage the—" The Divine Majesty shuddered as the main battle group opened fire. 12 human warships, their weapons targeted with computer precision at every critical system the Kethva vessel possessed. Not to destroy, that would have been easy, but to disable, to humiliate, to demonstrate that their divine technology was nothing more than an elaborate bluff. Within 30 seconds, the Divine Majesty was dead in space, its weapons offline, its engines silent, its crew experiencing the novel sensation of being outclassed by someone they'd considered primitive. "Unknown vessels," Vectar transmitted, his voice no longer carrying divine authority, but instead the desperate confusion of someone whose worldview had just been demolished with surgical precision. We surrender." "I'm sorry," Morrison replied, his voice carrying the kind of dangerous politeness that preceded really uncomfortable questions. "I didn't catch that. Could you repeat it a little louder? For the recording?" "We surrender." Louder. "We surrender." "Excellent! Now, Commander Vectar, I want you to transmit something on all frequencies. Tell every being in this system that the gods of the Kethva just got their asses handed to them by a bunch of humans who've had exactly 6 months to prepare for this fight. Tell them that the age of the hegemony is over." The transmission went out across the system, and Morrison could almost feel the shift in the cosmic balance as billions of beings across the galaxy received the message that would change everything. The gods could bleed. The gods could lose. The gods could be beaten by mortals who'd simply decided they'd had enough. The revolution started in the Kepler 442 system, approximately 17 hours after news of the Proxima Vega incident reached the local population. The Yithra were a species of crystalline beings who had once built cities that sang with harmonic resonance, their entire civilization based on the principle that beauty and function were inseparable concepts. They'd been subjugated by the Kethva for nearly 8,000 cycles, their cities converted to mining operations, their songs silenced in favor of more efficient resource extraction. When word reached them that the hegemony's garrison force in Proxima Vega had been defeated by something called humans, the reaction was immediate and violent. Mining Station Omega-7 was the first to go. The Yithra workers simply stopped working, formed harmonic circles, and began to sing. The sound they produced was unlike anything heard in 8 millennia, a song of rage, of hope, of beings who had suddenly remembered what freedom tasted like. The Kethva overseers tried to restore order using the usual methods: intimidation, threats, and the occasional demonstration of superior firepower. What they discovered was that beings who no longer feared their gods were remarkably difficult to intimidate. The uprising spread to 17 mining stations within 6 hours. By the end of the local day cycle, every Kethva facility in the system was under siege by Yithra, who'd spent 8,000 years learning to hate in harmony. Similar reports reached Kethva command centers across the galaxy. The Zephyrian collective in the Tau Ceti system had seized their orbital platforms. The Merhai and Proxima Vega were openly sabotaging tribute shipments. The artificial intelligences of the Gliese 667C system had suddenly decided that their programming no longer required them to serve organic masters who called themselves divine. Supreme Divinity Zithkar, still recovering from his encounter with Captain Morrison 6 months earlier, found himself dealing with the kind of crisis that the hegemony had never faced in its 14,000-year history. Widespread, coordinated rebellion across hundreds of star systems. "Tactical Hierophant Zethalos," he said, his voice carrying the strain of someone whose perfect worldview had developed several very large cracks. "Report on the current situation. Supreme Divinity, we have confirmed uprisings in 347 systems. The pattern appears to be similar in each case. Local populations have ceased tribute production and are actively resisting our governance. In 17 systems, our garrison forces have been overwhelmed entirely." Zithkar's compound eyes narrowed. "And what of these humans? The ones responsible for initiating this chaos?" "Intelligence suggests they have small battle groups operating throughout the outer territories. Each engagement follows the same pattern. They appear without warning, disable our forces with minimal damage, then broadcast recordings of our defeats across local communication networks. They're not trying to conquer our territories," Zithkar realized, his voice carrying the tone of someone who just understood that the game had changed entirely. "They're trying to inspire rebellion." "It would appear so, Supreme Divinity. And it's working. Every defeat we suffer weakens our divine image. Every system that rebels gives others the courage to follow suit." Zithkar stood in the command center of his flagship, surrounded by star charts showing the slow but inexorable collapse of everything his people had built, and felt something he'd never experienced before: genuine fear. Not fear of death. That was a concept the Kethva understood, even if they'd rarely had to confront it personally. But fear of irrelevance, fear of being proven wrong about the fundamental nature of reality itself. For 14,000 years, the hegemony had been the undisputed masters of this arm of the galaxy. They were gods, their subjects were worshippers, and the natural order of things was clear and unbreakable. Now a species they'd never heard of was systematically dismantling that order, one humiliating defeat at a time. "Zethlos," he said finally, "what do we know about these humans? Where did they come from? What do they want?" "According to our intelligence, they originate from a system they call Sol, approximately 27,000 light-years from the galactic core. They appear to be a relatively young spacefaring civilization. They've achieved faster-than-light travel only within the last 2 of their centuries." "A young species," Zithkar mused. "Then they should be easy to intimidate. What is their technological classification?" "That's complicated, Supreme Divinity. Their technology is less advanced than ours in some areas, more advanced in others. But their tactical doctrine is unlike anything in our experience. They don't fight to dominate or intimidate. They fight to win." Zethlos activated a holographic display showing tactical analyses of human combat methods. "They use speed and precision where we use overwhelming force. They target specific systems where we attempt total destruction. They coordinate their attacks with mathematical precision where we rely on individual divine inspiration. Most significantly, they appear to have studied our technology and tactics extensively, while we knew nothing of theirs until 6 months ago." Zithkar studied the displays with growing unease. Everything about human warfare was alien to Kethva understanding. Where the hegemony fought to demonstrate their divine superiority, humans seemed to fight with the cold efficiency of a species that had been doing it for a very long time. "What do our strategic analysts recommend?" he asked. They're divided, Supreme Divinity. Some believe we should negotiate with the humans, perhaps offer them a place within the hegemony in exchange for ending their campaign. Others suggest we should concentrate our forces and launch a massive retaliatory strike against their home system. "And what do you recommend, Tactical Hierophant?" Zethlos was quiet for a long moment, his mandibles clicking in what might have been contemplation or nervousness. "Supreme Divinity," he said finally, "I recommend we try to understand what we're actually fighting. These humans didn't attack us for territory, or resources, or strategic advantage. They attacked us because we threatened to enslave their species. They're not fighting for conquest, they're fighting for principle. And what principle is that? That no being has the right to claim dominion over another simply because they have the power to enforce it." The words hung in the air like an accusation. For the first time in his long life, Supreme Divinity Zithkar found himself wondering whether the hegemony's definition of divine right might need some revision. Captain Morrison stood on the bridge of the Retribution, watching the tactical display that showed the current state of what Earth's military planners had started calling Operation Prometheus, the systematic liberation of Kethva territory. In the 3 months since Proxima Vega, human battle groups had struck 97 Kethva systems. Not to conquer them, not to claim them, but to demonstrate that the hegemony could be defeated. Each victory had been broadcast across local communication networks. Each defeat of Kethva forces had been turned into propaganda that spread like wildfire through subjugated populations. The results had exceeded even Dr. Hayes' optimistic projections. Over 800 systems were now in open rebellion. Kethva tribute fleets were being attacked by their own cargo vessels. Garrison forces were surrendering rather than face populations who no longer feared divine retribution. The hegemony was collapsing from within, and humanity was providing the catalyst. "Sir," called his tactical officer, "we're receiving a priority transmission from Fleet Command." "Put it through." Admiral Vasquez's voice crackled over the communication system, carrying the kind of controlled excitement that usually preceded either very good news or very complicated orders. "David, we've just received a communication from the Kethva High Command. They want to negotiate." Morrison felt his eyebrows rise. Negotiate what? Terms of surrender, terms of ceasefire, terms of coexistence. The message wasn't entirely clear. What was clear is that Supreme Divinity Zithkar wants to meet with human representatives to discuss what he called a new understanding between our peoples. And what did you tell him? I told him we'd consider it, provided the meeting takes place in the Sol system, under human security, with full media coverage broadcast to every system in this arm of the galaxy. Morrison smiled. Even in negotiation, humanity was thinking like propagandists. When and where? Earth orbit 7 days from now. And David? They specifically requested that you be part of the human delegation. Me? Why? Apparently you've achieved something of a reputation among the Kethva. They're calling you the God Slayer. Morrison considered this new title with the expression of someone who'd just been told he'd been voted most likely to cause existential crises by an alien empire. Well, he said finally, that's not something you hear every day. The meeting took place aboard the UES Constitution, humanity's newest and largest vessel, constructed in the orbital yards above Earth specifically for occasions that required impressing people who thought they were gods. The ship was a testament to human engineering, fast, powerful, and bristling with enough weaponry to reduce small moons to their component atoms, all wrapped in a hull design that somehow managed to be both elegant and vaguely threatening. Supreme Divinity Zithkar arrived with a retinue of 12 vessels, each one a masterpiece of Kethva shipbuilding. They were beautiful, impressive, and utterly helpless against the 137 human warships that had assembled for the occasion. The meeting itself took place in the Constitution's main conference chamber, a space that had been designed with human diplomatic traditions in mind. Comfortable seating, subtle lighting, and absolutely no throne-like furniture that might encourage delusions of divine authority. Morrison sat at the conference table wearing his dress uniform and the expression of someone who'd spent the last 9 months systematically dismantling an interstellar empire. Across from him, Supreme Divinity Zithkar cut a much less impressive figure than he had 9 months ago. His golden exoskeleton was still polished, but the arrogance was gone, replaced by the careful wariness of someone who'd learned that the universe contained things that could bite back. "Commodore Morrison," Zithkar began, his voice carrying none of the bombastic authority that had characterized their first encounter. "I want to thank you for agreeing to this meeting." "Commander Zithkar," Morrison replied, deliberately omitting the Supreme Divinity title. "You're welcome. Though I should mention that this conversation is being broadcast to every inhabited system in this arm of the galaxy, so you might want to choose your words carefully." Zithkar's compound eyes twitched slightly, but he continued. "The hegemony wishes to discuss terms for coexistence with humanity and our former tributary worlds." "Former tributary worlds," Morrison repeated. "I like that. It has a nice ring to it. But let's be clear about something. We're not here to discuss coexistence with the hegemony. We're here to discuss the terms of its complete dismantlement. You cannot simply eliminate 14,000 years of galactic order," Zithkar protested. "The hegemony provides stability, security, divine guidance." "The hegemony," interrupted Admiral Vasquez from her seat at Morrison's right, "provides slavery, exploitation, and the systematic suppression of 400 billion sentient beings. That ends now. But without central authority, without divine guidance, those worlds will fall into chaos. Zithkar argued. They need leadership, they need direction, they need freedom, Morrison said flatly. And they're going to get it, whether you cooperate or not. The only question is whether you want to be part of the solution, or part of the problem that gets solved. Zithkar was quiet for a long moment, his mandibles clicking in what Morrison had learned to recognize as deep agitation. What do you want from us? He asked finally. Morrison leaned forward slightly. Here's what's going to happen. The hegemony is going to formally dissolve. Every tributary world is going to be granted complete independence. Every Kethva garrison is going to withdraw to your home system. You're going to return every piece of stolen technology, every cultural artifact, every resource that you've taken from conquered worlds over the past 14,000 years. That's impossible, Zithkar protested. The logistics are your problem, Vasquez said. You had 14,000 years to steal it all. You get 5 years to give it back. And if we refuse? Morrison smiled, and it was the kind of smile that had historically preceded very bad days for people who'd made very poor choices. Then we continue doing what we've been doing for the past 9 months. Human battle groups will visit every Kethva system, one by one, until you don't have any systems left. The difference is, this time we won't be trying to minimize casualties. The threat hung in the air like a sword. Zithkar looked around the conference table at the human faces surrounding him. Calm, determined, absolutely certain that they could follow through on their promises. You're asking us to abandon everything our civilization has built, he said quietly. No, Morrison corrected. We're asking you to abandon everything your civilization has stolen. There's a difference. And what of the Kethva people themselves? What happens to us? You go home, Admiral Vasquez said simply. You stay in your own system. You govern yourselves. You find something useful to do with your lives that doesn't involve enslaving other species. The galaxy is a big place. I'm sure you can find a hobby. Zithkar stared at the holographic star chart that dominated the center of the table, showing the Kethva home system in relation to the hundreds of worlds they'd once controlled. 14,000 years, he said finally. 14,000 years of galactic civilization, reduced to a single star system. 14,000 years of galactic tyranny, Morrison corrected. And yes, it's over. The only question is how much damage gets done before you accept that fact. There was a long silence as Zithkar contemplated the end of everything his people had built. Outside the conference chamber's viewports, Earth hung in space like a blue jewel, beautiful and serene and utterly unimpressed by Kethva pretensions of divinity. Very well, he said at last. The hegemony accepts your terms. We will begin the withdrawal immediately. Good, Morrison said. One more thing. I want you to make an announcement, broadcast to every system in this arm of the galaxy. Tell them that the Age of Gods is over. Tell them that from now on, beings govern themselves, make their own choices, determine their own destinies. Tell them that if anyone else shows up claiming divine authority, they should remember what happened to the last group that tried it. Zithkar's mandibles clicked once, a sound that might have been resignation or relief. It will be done. The announcement was broadcast 6 hours later, and Morrison watched it from the observation deck of the Constitution with the same mixture of satisfaction and melancholy that always followed the end of a long campaign. On screens across hundreds of star systems, Supreme Divinity Zithkar spoke words that would echo through galactic history. Beings of the galaxy, for 14,000 years, the hegemony of Kethva has claimed divine authority over your worlds, your lives, your destinies. Today I speak to inform you that this age has ended. The Kethva renounce all claims of dominion over other species. All tributary worlds are hereby granted complete independence. All garrison forces will withdraw to our home system within 1 standard year. He paused, and when he continued, his voice carried something that might have been humility. We were not gods. We were never gods. We were simply beings with advanced technology and the arrogance to believe that power granted us the right to rule others. We have learned, through the actions of a species called humanity, that true strength lies not in dominating others, but in respecting their right to determine their own path. The message concluded with coordinates for humanitarian aid distribution centers, reparation procedures, and contact information for the new Galactic Liberation Council that would help coordinate the transition to self-governance. Morrison turned away from the screen to find Admiral Vasquez approaching, 2 cups of coffee in her hands. Well, she said, offering him one of the cups. That's the end of the oldest empire in galactic history. How do you feel about making history? Morrison accepted the coffee and considered the question. Outside the viewport, human ships were already departing for their next assignments. Not conquest, but construction. Engineering vessels to help rebuild destroyed worlds. medical ships to provide aid to populations recovering from millennia of exploitation, and yes, warships to ensure that nobody else got any ideas about divine authority. Honestly, he said finally, I feel like we just finished the easy part. The easy part? Vasquez raised an eyebrow. We just toppled an interstellar empire spanning 17,000 star systems. Yeah, but that was just breaking things. Now comes the hard part, helping 400 billion beings learn how to be free again. Some of those worlds haven't made their own decisions in thousands of years. They're going to need guidance, support, protection. And you think humanity is up for that challenge? Morrison sipped his coffee and watched the construction vessels preparing for departure, each one loaded with supplies, technology, and personnel ready to spend years helping strangers learn to govern themselves. Admiral, he said, 9 months ago we were a single system species minding our own business. Today, we just liberated the largest empire in galactic history because it was the right thing to do, and we're already planning to spend the next century helping everyone else figure out what comes next. He smiled. Yeah, I think we're up for it. Epilogue. 5 years later. The First Galactic Congress convened in the Proxima Centauri system, chosen specifically because it was close enough to Earth to benefit from human organizational experience, but far enough away that nobody could accuse humanity of trying to build their own empire. Representatives from over 3,000 worlds attended, each one formerly part of the Kethva hegemony, each one now struggling with the challenges and opportunities of self-governance. The Yithra had rebuilt their singing cities and were teaching harmonic engineering to anyone willing to learn. The Merhai had restored their ocean gardens and were leading galaxy-wide efforts in environmental restoration. The artificial intelligences of Gliese 667c had formed the first truly cooperative AI collective and were revolutionizing computational science. Captain Morrison, now Admiral Morrison, thanks to a series of promotions he'd never asked for, stood in the observation gallery above the Congress floor, watching representatives from hundreds of species work together to draft the first truly universal declaration of sentient rights. It was messy, complicated, and occasionally descended into arguments about the philosophical implications of quantum consciousness theory. It was also the most beautiful thing he'd ever seen. "Penny for your thoughts?" asked a familiar voice. Morrison turned to see Dr. Hayes approaching, her hair now more gray than brown, but her eyes still carrying that same intense focus that had started this whole adventure. "Just thinking about how much has changed," he replied. 5 years ago, I was worried about one alien warship. Now we're helping coordinate the largest interspecies cooperation effort in galactic history. "Do you ever regret it?" Hayes asked. "Taking that first shot at the Eternal Dominion? Starting all this?" Morrison considered the question while watching a heated but peaceful debate between 3 different silicon-based life forms about the mineral rights provisions in the proposed galactic charter. "Doctor," he said finally, 5 years ago, 400 billion beings lived as slaves to creatures who called themselves gods. Today they're down there arguing about tax policy and environmental regulations, and whether artificial intelligences should have the right to vote on matters that affect biological organisms. He smiled. "No, I don't regret it. Not for a second." Below them, the Congress continued its work. Messy, democratic, gloriously free work. And somewhere in the distant Kethva system, a species of former gods was learning to make art instead of war, having discovered that creativity was a more sustainable hobby than oppression. The age of gods was over. The age of people had begun. And humanity, for better or worse, had become the species that taught the galaxy how to be free. It wasn't the worst legacy a species could have. The end.